In the archives of the Louisiana Supreme Court, there is a receipt that historians were never meant to find. Dated October 14th, 1850, it lists a transaction so financially impossible that it defies the entire economic logic of the era. The sum is 5,200 tons. In 1850, that amount of money purchased a grand estate, a fleet of merchant ships, or 20 field workers. But on this receipt, that fortune was paid for just one person. The item description is just 3 words. Eloise. Ivory complexion. She wasn't a laborer. She was a woman who walked into the auction block wearing Parisian silk, looking indistinguishable from the daughters of the men bidding on her. But the true horror isn't the price. It is what happened the moment the gavel fell. The High Sheriff of New Orleans burst into the room. He didn't come to rescue her. He didn't come to arrest the auctioneer. He stopped the sale to impound the evidence. Scrawled in red ink across the bottom of this receipt is a command that sealed her fate. Identity verify. Restricted access. Why would the law intervene to stop the sale of a slave, only to erase her existence from the public record? The answer lies in a silver-plated photograph found in her seized trunk. It shows Eloise sitting in a chair, staring accusingly at the camera. But look closely at the empty space beside her. Someone took a knife and violently scratched out the figure sitting next to her, but they missed one detail: a white hand resting on her shoulder, wearing a ring with the crest of the Supreme Court. This is not a story about slavery as you know it. This is the story of a family that ran a funeral home of horrors for their own bloodline. We have opened the file they tried to burn. And what we found explains why, for 50 years, the nuns at the Good Shepherd Convent reported the smell of vetiver perfume in a hallway where no one was allowed to speak. Before we unearth the documents that were meant to remain hidden forever, ensure you are subscribed to Before the Story and have enabled notifications as we delve into the archives that history tried to burn. If you believe that the truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be brought into the light, please like this video to help our investigation reach more minds. Let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight, and if you have ever heard of the lost files of the St. Louis Rotunda. The St. Louis Hotel in 1850 was the architectural crown jewel of the French Quarter, a sprawling edifice of granite and luxury that housed the social ambition of New Orleans' Creole aristocracy. Under its massive copper-plated dome lay the Rotunda, a space that served a dual and grotesque purpose. By day, it was a merchant exchange for cotton and sugar, and by noon, it transformed into the most sophisticated human market in North America. The atmosphere described in contemporary journals was one of suffocating opulence, where the scent of expensive Cuban cigars and French perfume mingled with the damp, earthy smell of human fear. It was here, beneath the indifferent gaze of marble columns, that the city's elite gathered to trade in lives with the casual detachment of stockbrokers. The Rotunda was not merely a market, it was a theater, where the boundaries of power were performed daily and where the obsession with lineage reached a fever pitch of paranoia. The artifact that anchors this investigation was found not in the public auction records, which were meticulously sanitized after the Civil War, but in a mislabeled box of civil litigation files from the 1850 term. The document is a bill of sale, number 4082, but it is accompanied by a series of private depositions that paint a picture of a city on edge. In the autumn of 1850, New Orleans was a powder keg of anxiety, with strict laws dictating that any trace of African ancestry, no matter how microscopic, condemned a person to legal servitude. The sheer number of mixed heritage individuals in the city, many of whom were indistinguishable from the white ruling class, created a silent terror among the elite. The fear that their own lineage might be tainted, or that the person they were bidding on might be one of their own. Into this volatile environment, the girl known only as Eloise was introduced to the block. The auctioneer's ledger describes the hush that fell over the room when she was presented, not in the rags of a field hand, but in a silk dress of pale blue, her hair arranged in the latest Parisian fashion. Witnesses stated that she did not look down, as was expected, but scanned the crowd with an expression of terrifying recognition. She did not weep. She stood with the posture of a debutante at a ball, a detail that unsettled the potential buyers more than any display of grief could have. The bidding did not follow the usual incremental pattern. It jumped in massive, aggressive leaps, driven by men who seemed desperate to possess her not for labor, but for silence. The price of $5,200 was an anomaly that sent shockwaves through the financial district, a sum so exorbitant it triggered an automatic review by the bank guarantors. To put this into perspective, a skilled craftsman or a prime worker might sell for $1,000 to $1,500. Eloise's price was an admission that she was not being sold as a worker, but as a dangerous secret that needed to be owned to be contained. The man who placed the final bid was not a plantation owner, but a proxy agent named Silas Vane, a man known in the legal underworld for handling the delicate disposal of unwanted heirs. His presence confirmed that this was no ordinary transaction. However, the transaction was never finalized. The interruption came from the High Sheriff, Léonce Thibodeau, whose arrival was recorded in the day's police blotter as a disturbance of commerce. Yet, the records suggest his intervention was not a raid to stop a crime, but a procedural halt ordered by a higher authority. The sheriff did not take Eloise into protective custody. He took her into judicial sequestration, a legal limbo reserved for disputed property. The crowd's reaction, recorded in the diaries of those present, was one of murmuring hostility, not at the cruelty of the sale, but at the violation of the privacy of the transaction. They knew that something deeply improper was unfolding, something that threatened the fragile illusion of their society. The impounded items found with Eloise were catalogued in a separate inventory list, which provides the first glimpse into the life she was being ripped away from. There was no worker's tool or coarse blanket. Instead, the sheriff's deputies seized a small trunk containing sheet music for the piano, a volume of French poetry inscribed with a birthday dedication, and a set of silver hairbrushes. These were the possessions of a young woman of status, raised with the expectation of a life of leisure. The dissonance between her possessions and her legal status is the first crack in the official narrative, suggesting that Eloise had been raised not just as free, but as a beloved daughter of privilege. The world-building of this tragedy relies on understanding the unspoken system of New Orleans, where wealthy men maintained long-term relationships outside of their marriages. These unions were recognized socially, but prohibited legally, creating a generation of children who lived in a gilded cage of ambiguity. Eloise was clearly the product of such a union, but the extreme value placed on her suggests her father was not merely wealthy, but a man of immense public standing whose reputation could not survive the revelation of her existence. The city was a place of masks, and Eloise's face was a mask that mirrored the elite too perfectly for their comfort. The atmosphere of the rotunda on that October day was heavy with the unspoken knowledge that a moral transgression was taking place. The men bidding on Eloise were likely associates of her father, perhaps even friends who had dined at his table, now participating in the betrayal of his flesh and blood. The silence of the victim, the aggression of the bidders, and the sudden intervention of the law all point to a conspiracy that had been orchestrated long before the auction began. It was a macabre theater where the script had been written by a powerful hand. intended to move Eloise from the parlor to the shadows without leaving a trace. But the trace remained. The receipt, with its red ink suspension, survived the fires and floods that claimed so much of New Orleans history. It sits in the archive today as a testament to a crime that was not defined by the theft of a person, but by the theft of a birthright. It establishes the central conflict of this investigation. A young woman raised to believe she was a daughter, suddenly reclassified as merchandise by the very system that had created her. The question that hangs over the rotunda is not just who sold her, but why the price of her silence was set so high, and what secret she carried that was worth a fortune to suppress. Among the items seized by Sheriff Thibodeau and locked away in the evidence room was a small, velvet-lined case containing a daguerreotype, a silver-plated photograph, which was a rare and expensive luxury in 1850. The image, preserved in the darkness of the archive, offers a haunting visual testimony that contradicts every legal description of Eloise. The plate shows a young woman of undeniable beauty, wearing a dress of fine lace, her posture rigid and elegant. But it is not the subject's face that constitutes the anomaly. It is the violence that has been inflicted upon the image itself. The daguerreotype has been deliberately defaced, with deep, jagged scratches gouged into the silver surface, obliterating the space directly beside her. Forensic analysis of the scratch marks reveals they were made with a sharp, metal instrument, likely a letter opener or a penknife, applied with significant force. The intent was clearly to erase someone who had been sitting in the chair next to Eloise. In 19th-century portraiture, such a pose, seated side by side, was reserved for close family members, signifying legitimacy and familial bond. The erasure suggests that Eloise was not photographed alone, but with a patron or parent who later decided that the visual evidence of their connection was too dangerous to exist. The act of scratching out the figure is a symbolic destruction, a crude attempt to rewrite history by physically destroying the record of a relationship. However, the person who attempted to destroy the image failed to notice a crucial detail that survived the vandalism. In the lower corner of the plate, resting on Eloise's shoulder, is a hand. It is the hand of a white male, distinguished by a heavy signet ring on the pinky finger. The ring is blurred by the slight movement of the subject during the long exposure, but the crest is partially visible under magnification. It depicts a pelican feeding its young, a common motif in Louisiana, but the specific design with a laurel wreath surrounding the bird is unique to a specific lineage of the judiciary. This disembodied hand, claiming the girl with a gesture of paternal affection, is the ghost in the machine, the undeniable proof of a connection that the law claimed did not exist. The existence of the daguerreotype itself is a paradox. Women in her legal position were almost never the subjects of expensive studio photography, and certainly not in poses of familial intimacy with elite men. The cost of such a portrait would have exceeded the monthly wages of a free laborer. That Eloise sat for this image implies that at one point she was cherished, acknowledged, and intended to be remembered. The transition from the sitter in this portrait to the lot number on the auction block represents a fall from grace so absolute that it defies the natural order of the social hierarchy. It suggests a sudden and catastrophic change in her circumstances, perhaps the death of a protector or a sudden betrayal. The reverse side of the daguerreotype casing bears a maker's mark from a studio on Royal Street, known for catering exclusively to the upper class. A search of the studio's surviving ledgers from 1850 reveals a gap in the appointments for the week of May 12th, pages that were torn out of the book. This absence of record is as telling as the record itself. It indicates that someone went to great lengths to remove the paper trail linking the commissioning of the portrait to the payment. The systematic removal of evidence, the scratched plate, the torn ledger, points to a coordinated effort to unperson Eloise, to transform her from a person with a history into a commodity with a price tag. The emotional weight of the image lies in Eloise's eyes. While the figure beside her has been scratched into oblivion, her gaze remains clear and direct, staring out across the century with an expression that has been described by archivists as unsettlingly accusatory. Unlike the vacant stares common in early photography due to the long exposure times, her eyes seem focused and intense, as if she's challenging the viewer to witness her reality. It is the face of someone who knows she is being erased and is using the camera as a final anchor to the world of the living. Accompanying the daguerreotype in the evidence box was a small silk pouch containing a lock of hair and a dried flower, likely a camellia. These are Victorian mementos of mourning or sentimentality, tokens exchanged between loved ones. The presence of such intimate objects in the possession of a woman about to be sold is heartbreaking. It suggests that Eloise clung to the symbols of her identity even as the legal machinery stripped her of her humanity. The contrast between the cold brutality of the auction receipt and the tender intimacy of the keepsake pouch creates a dissonance that highlights the cruelty of her situation. The anomaly of the daguerreotype forces the historian to confront the reality of conditional humanity in the antebellum South. Eloise was human and worthy of memorialization as long as her protector lived or willed it. The moment that protection was withdrawn, she became a thing. The scratched-out figure represents the cowardice of the patriarch who was willing to own her in private, but destroyed her in public. The hand on the shoulder remains the only surviving truth, a touch that was once affectionate, now frozen as a badge of ownership and betrayal. This visual evidence challenges the official narrative that Eloise was simply a woman caught in the gears of commerce. It proves she was a member of a family, a daughter who had sat for a portrait with her father, only to have him scratch himself out of the frame when her existence became a liability. The mystery deepens. Who was the man with the signet ring, and what event precipitated the decision to cast his own flesh and blood into the abyss of the market? The answer lies not in what was kept, but in what was so carefully destroyed. The investigation moves from the visual to the textual, with the discovery of a bundle of letters found wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the sheriff's evidence trunk. These letters are written in a precise, elegant French script and are signed by Madame Delphine, a free woman of color who operated a respectable boarding house on Rampart Street. The letters are addressed to an anonymous benefactor, but the tone is far from submissive. They are the desperate pleading and eventually furious missives of a mother figure who realizes she has been betrayed. The correspondence charts the course of Eloise's life and education, providing a timeline that completely contradicts the auctioneer's fraudulent claims. The early letters, dated from 1835 to 1845, describe the upbringing of a child of privilege. Madame Delphine details expenses for piano lessons, tutors in French literature and history, and seamstresses for custom gowns. She speaks of Eloise's progress in the parlor arts, her gentle disposition, and her resemblance to her father. These are not the records of raising a servant, they are the reports of a guardian raising a lady of society in the shadows. The expenses were paid promptly, as indicated by the attached receipts, suggesting the benefactor was a man of significant means who invested heavily in the girl's refinement. The anomaly here is the purpose. Why educate a girl for high society if she was legally destined for the auction block? As the dates approach 1850, the tone of the letters shifts dramatically. Madame Delphine begins to reference a solemn vow made by the benefactor to manumit, legally free, Eloise upon her 18th birthday and provide a dowry for her marriage to a gentleman in France. This plan, to send the child to Europe where the color line was less rigid, was a common exit strategy for the unrecognized children of the Creole elite. The existence of this plan proves that Eloise was never intended to be enslaved. She was being groomed for freedom and exile. The accumulated evidence of the receipts shows thousands of dollars spent on an education that would be worthless and indeed dangerous for a slave. The turning point in the correspondence occurs in the spring of 1850, coinciding with a sudden cessation of payments. Madame Delphine's writing becomes jagged and frantic. She mentions rumors of the benefactor's illness and the hostility of the Madame, presumably the benefactor's legal white wife. This is the first mention of the antagonist who would likely orchestrate Eloise's downfall. The letters describe the wife's agents coming to the boarding house, demanding an inventory of Eloise's possessions and threatening the household with police action. The anomaly deepens. A free woman had legal rights, yet Delphine writes of being powerless against the wrath of the legal house. One particular letter, dated August 1850, contains a chilling warning. Delphine writes, "They do not see a daughter. They see a sin that must be scrubbed from the ledger. They are pricing her beauty not for a husband, but for a monster." This suggests that the decision to sell Eloise was not financial necessity, but a punitive act. The Madame wanted to humiliate the girl, to drag her from the status of near white gentility down to the lowest rung of society. It was an act of vengeance against the living proof of her husband's indiscretion. The accumulation of these details paints a portrait of a domestic war where Eloise was the collateral damage. Crucially, the bundle includes a final, unopened letter. It is stamped with the official seal of the Louisiana Supreme Court, marked "Refused, Return to Sender." The refusal to acknowledge the correspondence marks the final severance of the bond. The benefactor, whether dead or incapacitated, had gone silent. This silence was the death knell for Eloise. Without his protection, her ambiguous status collapsed into the default legal status of her mother's lineage. The unopened letter represents the bureaucratic wall that was erected to trap her. The evidence also includes receipts for medical tonics administered to Eloise in the weeks leading up to the auction. Madame Delphine describes the girl as being in a stupor and unusually pliable. This aligns with the practice of drugging valuable individuals to ensure they appeared calm and compliant on the block. But in this context, it suggests a forced removal. Eloise did not walk willingly from Delphine's house to the rotunda. She was likely sedated and taken by force, bypassing the legal requirement for a judge to authorize the sale of a person who claimed freedom. The accumulation of these documents, the tuition bills, the letters referencing a European dowry, the refused appeals, builds a case of premeditated fraud. Eloise was not a slave being sold. She was a free woman being taken under the color of law. The education she received, meant to liberate her, became a tragic irony, increasing her market value to the predators of the rotunda while making her psychologically unsuited for the horror she was about to face. The letters give a voice to the silent victim, revealing a young woman who lived in the promise of a future that was stolen by the stroke of a pen. The final anomaly in this block is a small scrap of paper found with the letters, written in a different, heavy hand. It lists the name Silas Vane and a meeting time at the St. Louis Hotel. This links the Madame's agents directly to the proxy buyer, confirming that the auction was rigged. The accumulated evidence points to a conspiracy where the outcome was decided before the first bid was placed. Eloise was to be sold to Vane, disappeared, and erased, closing the book on the benefactor's past forever. The narrative now turns to the perspective of Valérien Saint-Cloud, a meticulous and cynical Creole notary whose personal journals provide the investigative spine of this story. Saint Clew was present at the rotunda on that October day, not as a bidder, but as a recorder of deeds, a man whose profession was to certify the transfer of property. His entry for October 14, 1850, departs from his usual dry, legalistic style and becomes a detailed chronicle of suspicion. St. Clew was the first to formulate a hypothesis that connected the white slave girl to the upper echelons of the judiciary. He writes, "The air in the rotunda was thick with the smell of perjury. The girl bears the unmistakable eyes of the Beauregard line, the heavy lids, the grey irises. It is as if the judge himself is standing on the block in petticoats." St. Clew's hypothesis posits that the auction was a sophisticated mechanism for laundering Eloise's status. In Louisiana law, the status of the child followed the condition of the mother. If Eloise's mother was enslaved at the time of birth, Eloise was enslaved regardless of her upbringing. However, if her father had tacitly recognized her as free, she had a claim to his estate. St. Clew theorizes that Judge Henri Beauregard, a man known for his harsh interpretations of the law, was ailing, and his legitimate heirs needed to sever this claim definitively. By selling her at public auction, they would create a chain of title that established her legally as property, overriding any informal freedom she had enjoyed. The notary notes the presence of Judge Beauregard's estranged nephew in the back of the room, whispering with Silas Vane. This observation solidifies the theory of an inside job. St. Clew writes, "They are not selling her for money. The Beauregards have gold enough to pave Royal Street. They are selling her to kill the past." He hypothesizes that Vane was instructed to purchase her and then transport her out of the state, perhaps to the houses of ill repute in the swamp or a plantation in the fever-ridden Caribbean, where she would die quickly and anonymously. The high price was a bribe to Vane, disguised as a market transaction to ensure the disposal was permanent. St. Clew also records the whispers among the other men in the room. The Creole society was small and insular. Everyone knew everyone's secrets. The murmurings were not of shock that a father would sell his daughter, such things happened, but of the recklessness of doing it so publicly. St. Clew speculates that the cruelty was the point. The public humiliation of Eloise was intended as a message to the city's colored aristocracy. No matter how white you look, no matter how educated you are one legal maneuver away from ruin. It was a reaffirmation of the hierarchy that the Beauregards relied upon for their power. The journal reveals St. Clew's own moral conflict. As a notary, he was a servant of the system, yet he was repulsed by the lack of decorum in this transaction. He notes, "We are wolves in silk waistcoats, devouring our own litter." His hypothesis extends to the sheriff's intervention. St. Clew does not believe Sheriff Thibodeau acted out of altruism. He suspects that a rival political faction, perhaps enemies of Beauregard, tipped off the police to create a scandal. The investigation was a weapon to be used against the judge, with Eloise merely the ammunition. St. Clew diligently transcribes the legal arguments he overhears in the coffee houses of the quarter. The core of the dispute was the definition of whiteness. If Eloise could be sold, then the definition of who was white and who was black was solely a matter of paperwork, not biology. This terrified the elite, many of whom had murky genealogies. St. Clew hypothesizes that the entire legal establishment would soon close ranks to crush Eloise, not because they hated her, but because her existence proved that their purity was a fiction. To save the system, the exception had to be destroyed. The notary's investigation leads him to check the parish birth records, where he finds a page carefully excised with a razor. This physical gap in the archive confirms his theory of a cover-up. "The absence of the record is the proof of the sin," he writes. he deduces that the Beauregards had long ago destroyed the birth certificate to prevent Eloise from proving her paternity. The auction was the final step in a decades-long process of erasure. St. Cloud realizes he is witnessing a crime that is perfectly legal, a murder committed with gavels and ledgers. St. Cloud's writings also reveal the phantom nature of the transaction. He notes that Silas Vane paid with a draft from a bank that Judge Beauregard sat on the board of. This circular flow of money from the father's bank to the proxy buyer confirms that the sale was a sham. The money was simply moving from one Beauregard pocket to another, minus Vane's fee. The hypothesis is damning. The judge was financing the destruction of his own child. Ultimately, St. Cloud's hypothesis frames the tragedy not as a trade incident, but as a dynastic purge. He predicts that Eloise will never be freed, because a free Eloise is a walking testament to the judge's hypocrisy. "She will be buried," he writes in a trembling hand, "either in the earth or in the archives, but she will not be allowed to walk in the sun." This grim prophecy sets the stage for the legal battle to come, where the truth of Eloise's blood would be weighed against the weight of her father's reputation. The suspension of the sale by Sheriff Thibodeau did not quell the unrest. It poured oil on the fire. The days following the incident at the Rotunda are documented in the editorials of the New Orleans Picayune and the Bee, which record a city fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. The scandal was not that a mixed heritage woman was being sold, that was commonplace, but that she was so indistinguishable from the daughters of the elite that it sparked a panic of passing. The newspapers published angry letters from citizens demanding a blood inquiry, fearing that if Eloise could be enslaved, perhaps their own children, or they themselves, were vulnerable to the whims of a malicious enemy with a forged ledger. The social fracture ran down the center of the St. Louis Cathedral, where Sunday Mass became a theater of cold shoulders and whispered accusations. The Beauregard family's pew sat conspicuously empty, a void that spoke louder than their presence. The diaries of society matrons record that the Eloise affair had made it impossible to ignore the shadow families that many patriarchs maintained. Wives began to look at their husbands with suspicion. Fathers looked at their children with anxiety. The polite silence that allowed this system to exist was shattered. The illusion that the worlds were separate and distinct had been exposed as a lie. In the coffee houses and law offices, the debate turned to the terrifying, arbitrary nature of the laws. If a woman who played Chopin and read Hugo could be dragged to the block, then culture and breeding were no protection. The fracture was class-based as much as it was racial. The free people of color, a wealthy and powerful demographic in New Orleans, felt the threat acutely. They saw in Eloise's fate a signal that their own status was being revoked. The archives contained petitions from prominent colored Creole families to the governor, demanding clarity on the laws of evidence regarding status. They knew that if Eloise fell, the precedent would endanger them all. The fracture also extended to the political sphere. Judge Beauregard's enemies seized upon the scandal. A rival faction, led by a populist politician who despised the old Creole aristocracy, used the sheriff's intervention to humiliate the judge. They leaked rumors to the press that the judge had polluted his line and was now trying to cover it up. The moral outrage was feigned. These men were owners themselves. But the political utility of the scandal was immense. Eloise became a pawn in a power struggle between the old money and the new American administration. The records show an increase in police patrols in the Treme district, the heart of the free community. The authorities responded to the social anxiety with force, cracking down on gatherings and checking papers with renewed aggression. The fear was that the Eloise incident would inspire unrest. The city was on a razor's edge. A letter from a nervous cotton factor to his partner in New York states, The city is a tinderbox. The girl in the jail has bewitched the populace. One spark and the quarter burns. Amidst this turmoil, the church found itself paralyzed. The baptismal records became a battleground. Priests were bribed and threatened by both sides, some to find proof of Eloise's mother, others to destroy it. The sanctity of the confessional and the archive was violated. The faithful were disillusioned to see the clergy acting as agents of the state's policing. The moral authority of the church, usually the bedrock of New Orleans society, crumbled under the pressure of the scandal. The social fracture was most visible in the refusal of the elite to invite the Beauregards to the upcoming opera season. This social ostracization was a death sentence in Creole society. The judge's wife, who had orchestrated the sale to cleanse her home, found that she had instead isolated it. By trying to remove the stain of Eloise, she had stained the entire family name with the reputation of clumsiness and vulgarity. To be cruel was acceptable. To be caught in a public spectacle was unforgivable. The documents also record a wave of manumissions in the weeks following the auction. It seems that some guilty fathers, spooked by the Beauregard scandal, rushed to legally free their own unrecognized children before they could be targeted. This unexpected consequence, a small ripple of freedom born from Eloise's tragedy, shows how deeply the event shook the conscience of the city. Men looked at their secret daughters and saw Eloise. They acted out of fear that they would be next to be exposed. Ultimately, the record of the social fracture shows a society fighting to maintain a delusion. The anger directed at Eloise and at the Beauregards was the anger of people forced to look in a mirror they had long ago covered up. The city wanted Eloise gone not because she was a slave, but because she was a glitch in the matrix of their reality. As long as she remained in the sheriff's custody, visible and unresolved, the fracture would not heal. The pressure to resolve the Eloise question grew until it demanded a decisive, brutal answer. While the city argued, Valérien Saint-Cloud went hunting. His journal entries from November 1850 describe a covert visit to the dusty archives of the St. Louis Cathedral. He knew that while civil birth records could be destroyed, the church rarely threw anything away. He was looking for the baptismal registry of 1831. St. Cloud describes the physical toll of the search, the heat, the dust, the fear of discovery by the guards who watched the archives. He was looking for a ghost, a record that officially didn't exist. What he found was a volume bound in cracking leather, smelling of mildew and incense. On page 204, he found the entry for Eloise, natural daughter of Marie-Thérèse, free woman of color. Doyle, the space for the father's name was blank, or so it appeared to the naked eye. However, St. Cloud, armed with his notary's tools, noticed that the paper in that blank space was thinner, abraded by a knife. Someone had scraped the ink off the parchment years ago. But ink penetrates, it stains the fibers deep below the surface, and the pressure of the quill leaves a valley in the paper that can remain for centuries. St. Cloud performed a frottage, a rubbing technique using a soft graphite stick and a thin sheet of onion skin paper. As he rubbed the charcoal over the surface, the ghost of the letters began to emerge from the valley of the scratch. The relief was faint but undeniable. The letters HENRIBEAU appeared in the negative space. The irrefutable evidence lay before him. Judge Henri Beauregard had not only fathered Eloise, but had stood at the font and signed his name to her soul, only to come back later or send an agent to scrape himself out of her salvation. The impact of this discovery on St. Cloud was profound. His handwriting in the journal becomes erratic. He realizes he holds a weapon that could destroy the judiciary of Louisiana. "It is not just a name," he writes. "It is a confession." The scraping of the name was a rejection of the sacrament. To a religious society, this was a betrayal far worse than infidelity. The judge had tried to deceive God as well as the law. St. Clow felt the weight of the paper as if it were lead. He cut the page from the registry, a crime in itself, and hid it in his vest. The documented impact of this evidence, however, was not the explosive public revelation St. Clow might have hoped for. He attempted to show the rubbing to a sympathetic editor at the Bee, but the man refused to look at it, warning Saint. Clue that men have been challenged to duels for less and disappeared for much less. The fear of the Beauregard influence was absolute. The evidence was irrefutable, but the system refused to receive it. Truth requires a receiver, and in 1850 New Orleans, the receiver was off the hook. St. Clow then approached the defense attorney appointed to Eloise, a drunken court-appointed lawyer named Mr. Pellerin. Pellerin looked at the rubbing and wept, not from pity, but from fear. He told St. Clow that the judge had already sent word. If Eloise's defense relied on proving paternity, the lawyer would be disbarred and exiled. The irrefutable evidence was rendered inert by the threat of brute force. The impact on Pellerin was to drive him further into the bottle. He realized the trial was a sham, and he was merely a player in a tragedy. The existence of the rubbing did, however, change the strategy of the opposition. Rumors of St. Clow's discovery reached the Beauregard camp. Their response was documented in a sudden flurry of legal filings. They moved to expedite the hearing, skipping the usual discovery phase. They knew the truth was out there, scratching at the door, and they needed to seal the tomb before it could enter. The evidence accelerated the doom of the accused. St. Clow's journal records his own terrifying isolation. He began to notice men following him. His office was broken into, though nothing was stolen. A warning. The irrefutable evidence became a burden. He realized that proving Eloise was white, or the daughter of a white man, would not save her. It would only ensure that her destruction had to be total. To acknowledge her now would be to admit to the attempted sale of a free woman, a crime of kidnapping. The judge was too deep in the lie to turn back. The block concludes with St. Clow hiding the rubbing inside the lining of his law books, the only place he felt was safe. He writes a passage of despair. Truth is a poor shield against power. I have the proof, and it is worthless. The ink is stronger than the blood, but the sword is stronger than the ink. The irrefutable evidence proved Eloise's right to freedom, but in doing so, it sealed her fate as a liability that could never be allowed to speak. The legal machinery of New Orleans, usually a slow and grinding apparatus, moved with terrifying speed to resolve the Eloise problem. Indeed, the collapse of authority was not a breakdown of order, but a corruption of it. The records of the closed-door meetings at the judge's estate, reconstructed later from the testimony of servants and junior clerks, reveal the moral vacuum at the center of the city's leadership. The judge, the district attorney, and the bishop's representative met not to seek justice, but to craft a narrative that would survive scrutiny. Judge Beauregard, documented in these accounts as looking pale and ghostly, recused himself from the public proceedings, but directed the strategy from the shadows. The dilemma was existential. If he acknowledged Eloise, he admitted to crossing racial lines and fraud. If he condemned her, he sacrificed his child. The authority of the father collapsed into the survival instinct of the politician. The strategy decided upon was statutory erasure. They would not argue that she was his daughter. They would argue that her lineage was a fabrication of Madame Delphine, a fraud designed to extort the family. The collapse extended to the medical establishment. 2 prominent physicians were summoned to the jail to examine Eloise. Their report, preserved in the court file, is a masterpiece of pseudoscience. They were tasked with finding characteristics in a woman who looked white to prove she was black. The report details the measurement of her skull, the curvature of her spine, and the blue tint of her fingernails, all junk science of the era used to justify hierarchy. The doctors, pillars of their community, signed their names to a lie, stating that despite her appearance, her biological constitution was unmistakably African. Science bowed to politics. The sheriff, Léonce Thibodeau, who had initially stopped the auction, was brought to heel. Records show a sudden deposit into his re-election fund from a Beauregard-affiliated bank. His testimony changed. He no longer claimed he suspected fraud. He claimed he stopped the sale to protect the buyer from damaged goods. The guardian of the law became a paid accomplice. The authority of the police was revealed to be a mercenary force. The church, too, collapsed. The bishop sent a letter to the convent of the Good Shepherd instructing the Mother Superior to prepare a cell for a special penitent. The church would not fight for her freedom, it would provide the prison. They framed her confinement as an act of mercy, saving her from the auction block by hiding her in the cloister. It was a spiritual plea bargain. The church would hide the judge's sin if the judge donated the sinner to the church. The trial itself, a verification hearing, was a farce. The transcript shows that Eloise was not allowed to speak. When she attempted to address the bench, the presiding magistrate, a crony of Beauregard, ordered her silenced, citing that property has no voice in the court of equity. The legal authority that was supposed to protect the vulnerable was used to gag the victim. The courtroom was closed to the public in the interest of public decency, a euphemism for burying the truth. St. Clo's journal records the moment the verdict was read. There was no gavel bang, just a quiet scratching of a pen. Eloise was declared statutorily black and a ward of the state due to her vagrant nature. The price of $5,000 was voided. She was valued at 1,000 dirhams for the purpose of the transfer. The collapse of authority was complete. The law had successfully turned a human being into a rounding error. The documents from this period reek of cowardice. Every official involved passed the buck, signed the paper, and looked away. They told themselves they were preventing a riot, saving a family, upholding the law. But the records show the truth. They were frightened men crushing a girl because she made them uncomfortable. The collapse was not noisy. It was the quiet, synchronized shutting of doors. The final record of this collapse is a letter from the judge to his lawyer, thanking him for restoring order. It is a chilling document, devoid of any mention of the girl, focusing only on the polls and the harvest. It shows a man who has successfully cauterized his conscience. Authority had survived, but it had lost its soul. The narrative arc takes a sharp turn with the discovery of a source that lay hidden for decades, not in an archive, but in the false bottom of a jewelry box sold at an estate auction in 1920. It is the private diary of the judge's wife, Madame Clarisse Beauregard. Written in a frantic, spidery hand, the diary reveals that the architect of Eloise's destruction was not the judge, but Clarisse herself. The entry dates align perfectly with the cessation of payments to Madame Delphine. Clarisse writes of her discovery of the shadow daughter and the rage that consumed her. "He gave her my mother's name," she writes, a detail that explains the depth of her hatred. Eloise was not just a symbol. She was a usurper, walking around the city with the face of the judge and the name of the wife's ancestors. The hidden source reveals that the judge was weak, a passive figure who wanted to let Eloise leave for France. It was Clarisse who intercepted the letters, stopped the payments, and ordered the agents to seize the girl. The diary details the dowry lie. Clarisse admits to sending a forged letter to Madame Delphine, promising that the agents were coming to escort Eloise to the ship for France. This explains why Eloise went with them without a struggle, why she was dressed in her finest silk. She thought she was going to freedom. Clarisse describes her satisfaction at the deception. Let her dress for a wedding. She will find only a funeral for her pride. The source creates a new layer of horror, domestic malice. The cruelty was not abstract or economic, it was personal and vindictive. Clarisse viewed Eloise as a stain on her own honor. She writes of scrubbing the floor of her life. The auction was her idea, a public humiliation designed to break the girl's spirit before she was discarded. The diary also reveals that the judge was being manipulated by his wife. Clarisse threatened to expose other secrets, financial improprieties, other indiscretions, if he intervened. The collapse of authority in the previous block is recontextualized. The judge was not just protecting his career, he was terrified of his wife. The hidden source shifts the antagonist role to the domestic sphere, showing how the patriarchy could be weaponized by the matriarch. One entry describes Clarisse watching the auction from a carriage with drawn curtains. She wanted to see the moment the gavel fell. Her disappointment at the sheriff's intervention is palpable. "The law is a clumsy tool," she complains. "I should have used poison." This admission of lethal intent confirms that Eloise was never safe. If the auction failed, murder was the backup plan. The diary ends abruptly in 1853, the year of the fire. The final pages are filled with ramblings about a smell in the house that she cannot wash out. She complains that the servants are useless, that the scent of vetiver, Eloise's perfume, is stuck in the curtains. The hidden source bridges the gap between the historical and the supernatural, documenting the beginning of the haunting that would consume the family. This discovery reorders the moral universe of the story. Eloise was trapped between a father who abandoned her and a stepmother who actively hunted her. The diary serves as a confession from the grave, a testament to the corrosive power of jealousy and the brutal lengths to which the elite would go to maintain the facade of the perfect family. The sham hearing concluded, but the problem of Eloise's physical presence remained. The verification hearing had stripped her of her rights, but she was still in the city jail, a living symbol of the scandal. The decision for the final course of action is found in a sealed order from the district attorney's office, justified by the mental instability of the prisoner. The document claims that Eloise had ceased to speak and was prone to fits of melancholia, rendering her unfit for sale or labor. The justification was a lie to cover the final disposal. They could not sell her south because she might talk. They could not free her because she might sue. The only option was an oubliette, a place of forgetting. The decision was made to commit her to the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, a convent that doubled as a reformatory for fallen women. The order frames this as an act of Christian charity, a way to save her soul from the sin of her birth. The document details the transfer arrangements with military precision. It was to be done at night, in a closed carriage. No names were to be used. The intake forms were pre-filled with the name Sister Silence. The erasure of her identity was codified in the instructions. The subject is to be denied all contact with the outside world. No letters, no visitors, no mirrors. The justification was that vanity was her sin and obscurity was her penance. St. Cloud's journal records his knowledge of this decision. He watched the carriage leave the jail. He writes of his urge to shout, to throw a rock, to do something. But he justifies his inaction with the cold logic of survival. To speak now is to join her in the dark. The decision for action belonged to the state. The decision for inaction belonged to the witness. He chose to survive to tell the tale, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. The convent's acceptance letter is the final piece of this block. The Mother Superior acknowledges receipt of the donation from the Beauregard estate, a significant sum given in exchange for taking the problem off their hands. The church accepted the money. The decision was transactional. Eloise was bought one last time, not by a master, but by the bride of Christ. The transfer document lists her personal effects, which were confiscated and destroyed. The silk dress, the sheet music, the books. The only thing she was allowed to keep was a rosary. The decision was to strip her of every marker of her former life, to reduce her to a generic penitent. The justification was spiritual cleansing. But the reality was identity theft. The narrative tension peaks with the description of the convent gates closing. This was the true death of Eloise. The auction block was terrifying, but the convent was final. The decision to bury her alive in the cloister was the ultimate expression of the white slave girl paradox. She was too white to be worked in the fields, too black to be free, and too dangerous to be seen. The only place for her was nowhere. The narrative fast-forwards to the final primary source, the intake ledger of the Convent of the Good Shepherd, discovered during the demolition of the building in the 1970s. The ledger is a heavy black book listing the thousands of women who passed through the gates. Entry 890, dated November 14, 1850, reads, Sister Silence, age approx 19, origins unknown, ward of the state. But it is the marginalia, the notes written by the nuns over the subsequent decades, that tell the true story. The notes describe a woman who never spoke a single word for 51 years. She performed her duties in the laundry with mechanical precision. She never cried, never prayed aloud, never interacted with the other penitents. She became a ghost before she died. However, the ledger notes one anomaly. Sister Silence hums. The nuns recorded that while working, she would hum a specific melody. Musicologists later identified the tune not as a hymn, but as a lullaby from a French opera popular in New Orleans in the 1840s, the same music found in her trunk. It was her single act of resistance, a sonic thread connecting her to the life that was stolen. The final entry for Sister Silence is dated 1901. Died in her sleep, buried in the pauper's plot, no family notified. But pasted into the ledger, contrary to all rules, is a small snippet of grey fabric. The note explains, found sewn into the hem of her habit, a silver lock of hair. Eloise had managed to keep one piece of herself, or perhaps her father, hidden for half a century. The interpretation of this source is devastating. It reveals the sheer endurance of the human spirit's refusal to be completely erased. The silence was not submission, it was a fortress. By refusing to speak, she refused to participate in the lie of her new identity. She remained Eloise, in the quiet of her own mind, humming her opera, guarding her lock of hair. The ledger also records the incidents around her cell. Nuns reported the smell of vetiver, a rich, earthy perfume that was strictly forbidden, lingering in the hallway outside her door. The source interprets this not as a haunting, but as a manifestation of her will. She projected her past into the sterile air of the convent. The final primary source confirms that the system won. She died a slave of the state, nameless and poor. But it also confirms that the system failed. It never broke her interior world. The lock of hair proves she remembered. The humming proves she felt. The erasure was legal, but not spiritual. The consequences of the Eloise affair rippled outward, dismantling the lives of those who conspired against her. The documents record a rapid decline in the Beauregard fortune. In 1853, 3 years after the auction, a fire broke out in the St. Louis Hotel Rotunda. It was a minor blaze, but the smoke damage was extensive. The strangest report came from the fire brigade. They claimed the empty rotunda smelled of vetiver and burning silk. That same week, Judge Henri Beauregard suffered a massive stroke. He did not die immediately. He lingered for 2 years, paralyzed, unable to speak, trapped in his own body just as he had trapped his daughter in the convent. St. Clo's Journal notes the irony with grim satisfaction. The silencer is silenced. The judge died screaming with his eyes, a prisoner of his own flesh. Clarisse Beauregard did not fare better. The haunting she described in her diary worsened. She became a recluse, convinced that the house was infested with invisible guests. She died in an asylum in 1860, raving about a girl in a blue dress standing at the foot of her bed. The family line ended with them. Their legitimate children died of yellow fever or war, leaving no heirs. The name Beauregard, in that specific branch, was extinguished. The legacy of the case lived on in the legal precedents of Louisiana. The verification hearing became a dark citation in future cases, used to strip rights from mixed heritage citizens. Eloise became a legal ghost, a case study in the absolute power of the state to define race. Valérien Saint-Cloud lived to be an old man, but he never practiced law again after 1850. He became a recluse, guarding the rubbing of the baptismal certificate. He left it to the archives in his will, with a note, "For the girl when she can be named." His legacy was the preservation of the truth, a time capsule waiting for a more just era. The convent, before its demolition, became the subject of local legend. Orphans raised there spoke of the Lady of the Vetiver, a benevolent but sad presence in the laundry room. The legacy of Eloise transformed from a legal scandal into a folklore spirit, the patron saint of the forgotten. The final consequence is the survival of the documents themselves. Despite the fires, the floods, and the deliberate attempts to burn the records, the receipt, the diary, and the ledger survived. It is as if history itself refused to let go of the story. The legacy is the video you are watching now, the resurrection of a name that was meant to be spoken, nevermore. Today, the site of the St. Louis Hotel is the Omni Royal Orleans, a luxury hotel where tourists drink cocktails and listen to jazz, largely unaware of the human market that once operated in the lobby. But in the archives of New Orleans, the file of Eloise remains open. Modern restoration technology has finally cleared the scratches from the daguerreotype. The face of the man has been revealed. It is, undeniably, Judge Henri Beauregard. The signet ring matches the family crest perfectly. The visual proof that St. Cloud sought is now visible to the world. The historian looks at this image and sees not just a tragedy of the past, but a mirror of the present. It is a story about how institutions protect themselves at the expense of the vulnerable, how science can be bent to serve prejudice, and how the law can be a weapon of erasure. Eloise's story challenges us to look at the blank spaces in our own history books and ask, who was scratched out? The open question remains, what happened to the child she might have carried? Some interpretations of the Madame Delphine letters suggest Eloise was pregnant when she was taken, not by a lover, but as a result of a violation by the agent Vane. If a child was born in the convent, where did it go? Are there descendants of Eloise walking the streets of New Orleans today, unaware that their great-grandmother was the white slave girl? The scent of vetiver is still reported by the night security staff at the archives when Box 4082 is opened. It serves as a sensory reminder that some things cannot be archived. The story of Eloise ends on paper, but it continues in the ether. She was found in the ledger, but she is still waiting to be truly found by justice. We leave you with this image: a father who erased himself to save his reputation, and a daughter who stared into the lens and refused to blink. History is written by the victors, but the truth is kept by the survivors. The archives are deep, and many more files remain sealed. If you believe that these stories deserve to be told, that the silenced voices of history should be amplified, join our investigation. Click the subscribe button for Before the Story and ring the bell. History is not just what is written, it is what is hidden. Until next time, keep looking for the truth in the margins.